The applause swelled as Noah Schnapp stepped onto the stage, the familiar warmth of the Kelly Clarkson Show wrapping around him like a practiced embrace. He smiled and waved, a little bashful, a little rehearsed, the way someone does when they've spent years growing up in front of cameras but still hasn't fully adjusted to being the center of adult conversations. Kelly stood to greet him with an enthusiastic hug, praising how audiences had watched him evolve from a child actor into a young man navigating fame in real time. Noah laughed politely, thanking her, easing into his chair as the crowd settled. At first, everything moved smoothly. They talked about work, long shooting days, the surreal experience of finishing a chapter of his life that had defined him since childhood, and the strange whiplash of suddenly having space to figure out who he was outside of a set. Noah spoke thoughtfully, choosing his words with care, hands resting neatly in his lap. The audience responded warmly, clapping at the right moments, laughing when he joked about how awkward it felt watching himself grow up on screen. Kelly leaned into the conversation with her usual charm, nodding along, asking about future plans, music he'd been listening to, how he stayed grounded. Noah relaxed a bit more, shoulders loosening, his answers becoming more natural, less guarded. It felt like one of those interviews designed to humanize rather than interrogate, to give viewers a sense of ease and familiarity. Then Kelly shifted slightly in her chair, glancing down at her cue cards before looking back up at him. Her tone softened, but the pivot was unmistakable. She referenced recent public attention Noah had received, carefully at first, saying he'd been in the headlines for reasons beyond his work. She asked how he handled criticism and whether he felt misunderstood by people who only saw fragments of him online. The room grew quieter. Noah's smile faded just enough to notice. He straightened in his chair, taking a brief pause before answering. He said criticism came with the territory, especially at his age, and that he tried to learn from it without letting it define him. His voice was calm, but the careful precision in his words suggested he was navigating a familiar minefield. Kelly nodded, encouraging him to continue, then added that fans often felt invested in him, that they wanted clarity when controversies arose. She asked whether he felt a responsibility to explain himself more directly, especially when people felt hurt or confused. The phrasing was gentle, but the weight of the question pressed in. Noah inhaled slowly. He said he believed conversation mattered, but so did boundaries. He explained that being young in the public eye meant every sentence could be pulled apart, stripped of context, and turned into something he never intended. He said sometimes stepping back wasn't avoidance, it was self-preservation. The audience murmured softly, a few nodding in understanding. Kelly leaned forward, clearly engaged. She suggested that silence could sometimes be misread, that people might fill in gaps with assumptions. She framed it as concern, not accusation, but her persistence sharpened the edge. Noah acknowledged the point, saying misinterpretation was frustrating, but he also believed not every conversation belonged on a daytime couch, compressed into minutes and framed by applause. Kelly interrupted him mid-thought, gently but decisively, saying viewers valued honesty and that avoiding direct answers could come across as deflection. The interruption was subtle, but Noah noticed. His jaw tightened slightly. He tried to continue, explaining that honesty didn't always mean immediacy, that some issues required reflection and privacy. Kelly interjected again, reframing his response as caution bordering on defensiveness. The audience grew still. The easy rhythm of the interview faltered. Noah leaned forward now, elbows resting lightly on his knees, voice firmer but still controlled. He said he didn't mind tough questions, but he didn't want his experiences reduced to a segment designed to provoke reaction. He said he'd come to talk about his work and growth, not to relitigate moments that were still unfolding in his own life. Kelly laughed briefly, an instinctive attempt to ease the tension, saying she wasn't trying to put him on trial. The word lingered anyway. Noah's expression didn't change. He replied that sometimes the line between curiosity and cross-examination felt thin, especially when the cameras were rolling and the audience expected a moment. Kelly countered that difficult conversations were part of growth, especially for public figures. Her tone remained friendly, but the pressure increased. Noah nodded, acknowledging the reality of fame, but added that growth also meant learning when to say no, when to protect parts of yourself that didn't belong to public consumption. The exchange sharpened. Kelly asked whether refusing to engage risked alienating fans who cared. Noah responded that fans who truly cared would respect his boundaries. The applause was hesitant, scattered. The tension now sat openly between them, no longer disguised as banter. Kelly tried to reframe again, saying she was just asking what many people at home were wondering. Noah replied quietly that sometimes what people wondered wasn't what they were entitled to know. The studio fell into a near silence, the kind that makes every movement feel louder. Cameras adjusted, catching the subtle shifts in posture, the tightening expressions. Kelly tried to smooth the moment with a practiced smile, leaning back in her chair and letting out a light laugh that usually reset the room. She said she understood boundaries, truly, but added that part of her job was to ask what people at home were thinking. The phrasing sounded reasonable, even kind, but there was an edge to it now, a subtle implication that Noah was dodging rather than choosing. The audience shifted in their seats, sensing the tension deepen instead of dissolve. Noah nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the effort without accepting the premise. He took a breath, shoulders rising and falling, then spoke again. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but it carried. He said he respected the show and the platform, but there was a difference between curiosity and pressure. He said he'd answered what he was comfortable answering, and pushing beyond that didn't make the truth clearer, it just made it louder. Kelly tilted her head, her expression tightening just a bit. She replied that discomfort was often where growth happened, that avoiding it didn't help anyone. The line sounded rehearsed, something she'd said many times before to guests who hesitated. But this time it didn't land the way it usually did. Noah's jaw clenched, and for the first time since he'd walked out, a flicker of frustration broke through his careful composure. He said growth also came from learning to protect yourself, especially when you'd spent most of your life being accessible to strangers. He talked about how growing up on camera blurred lines that other people his age were only just learning to draw. He said he wasn't refusing conversation, he was choosing where and how it happened. The audience responded with soft applause, tentative but supportive. Kelly interrupted again, this time less gently. She said it sounded like he wanted the benefits of fame without the accountability. The words hit the room hard. A few gasps escaped before anyone could stop them. Noah went still, eyes fixed on Kelly, as if he were absorbing not just the sentence but everything it implied. When he spoke again, his voice was firmer, the warmth gone. He said accountability wasn't the same as public confession. He said being young didn't mean being obligated to perform vulnerability on demand. He reminded her that he was still learning, still growing, and that mistakes didn't automatically grant the world unlimited access to his inner life. Kelly's smile faded completely. She crossed one leg over the other and said audiences expected honesty, not rehearsed answers. The word, rehearsed, stung. Noah let out a small, humorless laugh. He said the irony was that he was being criticized for being careful in a space that punished people for speaking too freely. He said he'd seen how quickly words could be twisted, and he wasn't willing to hand over more ammunition. The audience was silent now, fully engaged, the earlier warmth replaced by a charged stillness. Producers hovered at the edge of the stage, eyes darting between the hosts and the clock. Kelly glanced briefly toward them, then back to Noah, pressing on. She said viewers might feel disappointed, that walking away from tough topics could look like avoidance. That was the moment Noah's restraint finally gave way, not into anger, but into clarity. He leaned forward, hands resting on his knees, and said quietly that he wasn't walking away from tough topics. He was walking away from being cornered. He said there was a difference, and pretending otherwise wasn't fair. His words cut through the studio with precision, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Kelly bristled, responding that she wasn't cornering him, just doing her job. Noah nodded again, acknowledging her perspective, then said evenly that he was doing his job too, protecting his mental health and his future. He said he'd learned the hard way that not every platform was safe for every conversation, no matter how friendly it looked on the surface. A murmur spread through the audience, growing into applause. Kelly opened her mouth to respond, but Noah continued, his voice steady and unwavering. He said he was grateful for the opportunities he'd been given, but gratitude didn't mean compliance. He said respect went both ways, and in that moment, he didn't feel heard, only pushed. The room felt suspended, like everyone was holding their breath at once. Kelly's expression shifted from frustration to surprise, then to something closer to disbelief. She said she thought he was being unfair, that she'd invited him with good intentions. Noah met her gaze and said he believed that, but intentions didn't erase impact. Then, without drama, he stood. The movement was subtle but seismic. Chairs creaked softly as people in the audience leaned forward. Noah smoothed his jacket, his hands steady despite the tension crackling through the studio. He thanked Kelly for having him, his tone polite but distant now, and thanked the audience for listening.